The snow came down like a curtain drawn across the world. Hank Donnelly hunched low over his Harley, feeling every frozen mile in the marrow of his bones. The road ahead was a gray ghost vanishing into white, where the headlight lost its nerve. His beard had turned to ice. His knuckles, tattooed with letters that spelled "Hold Fast" across both hands, had gone numb an hour ago. None of it mattered. He had nowhere to be, and no one waiting, so the storm was just weather, and weather was just another thing to push through. The mountains rose on either side of the highway like the walls of a cathedral built for no congregation. Pine trees bent under the weight of fresh powder. The wind howled through the passes with a sound like grief, long and low and bottomless. Hank had been riding through these mountains for the better part of 2 decades, and the loneliness of them still suited him. He preferred landscapes that did not ask questions. He was 58 years old. His hair had gone the color of dirty steel. His body carried the evidence of every bad decision he had ever made. The scar tissue of bar fights, the ache of a knee shattered in a brawl outside Reno, the dull throb in his lower back from a fall off a flatbed truck in his 20s. He wore his Hell's Angels vest under his leather jacket, though he had not attended a meeting in over a year. The patches and insignia were fading. So was the man who had earned them. His mind drifted, as it always did when the road got empty enough to Claire. His little sister. 12 years of silence between them now. 12 years since she had stood in the doorway of his apartment with red eyes and trembling hands begging him to leave the life he had chosen. "You are all I have left, Hank. Please." He had told her some men could not change. He had told her she was better off without a brother like him. He had watched her walk away carrying all of her hope and all of her disappointment, and he had not called her back. The memory stung worse than the wind. Hank squinted through the wall of falling snow. Road signs were barely visible. Another 30 miles to the next town. He would find some motel with a neon vacancy sign and a mattress that smelled like cigarettes, and he would sleep the way he always slept, badly, with dreams that woke him, reaching for things that were no longer there. The bike slipped on a patch of black ice. The rear wheel kicked sideways. Hank corrected instinctively, his body remembering what his mind had stopped paying attention to. His heart slammed against his ribs. The storm was getting dangerous, even by his standards. A small turnout appeared on his right, some kind of scenic overlook, though there was nothing scenic about it now, just a guardrail and a wall of white. Hank guided the Harley toward it, the tires crunching through 6 inches of fresh accumulation. He killed the engine. The silence was immediate and total. Nothing but the hush of falling snow and the distant moan of wind through the pines. Hank pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his flattened hair. He was tired. Not just road-weary, but the kind of tired that lived in his chest and had been there so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The exhaustion of a man who had carried too much guilt for too many years and had never once set it down. Getting Old Stone, he muttered, using the name his brothers in the club had given him. The name that fit him about as well as everything else in his life, which was to say, not at all. Something caught his eye. Through the curtain of falling snow, a flash of color. Bright, unmistakable wrong for this landscape. Hank narrowed his eyes and peered into the darkness beneath a massive pine tree about 20 yards from the turnout. There it was again. Something purple. Something moving. Every instinct in his body told him to stay on the bike. This was not his problem. He did not get involved. He had built his entire adult life around the principle of not getting involved, and it had served him well enough, or at least it had kept him alive. But his boots were already in the snow. He was already walking. The powder came up past his ankles, soaking through his jeans. The cold barely registered. His focus had narrowed to that spot of color in the growing dark. As he got closer, the shape became clear, and something inside Hank Donnelly broke open like a frozen pipe. A child, a little girl. She sat huddled against the trunk of the pine, knees pulled up to her chest, wearing a bright purple coat that was much too thin for this weather. Her small shoulders shook. She was crying, but the sound was so faint it was almost swallowed by the storm. Hank stopped. His boots sank into the snow. His breath came out in a cloud that the wind tore apart. The little girl lifted her head, sensing his presence. Her face was streaked with tears, her cheeks raw and red from cold. She could not have been more than 4 years old. In her small hands, she clutched something flat and rectangular, pressing it against her chest as if it were the last solid thing in a dissolving world. "Hey," Hank called out. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by wind and decades of hard living. You okay? The girl stared at him. Her eyes were wide, caught between hope and fear. She did not answer. You lost, Hank asked, keeping his distance. He knew what he looked like. He had spent years cultivating an appearance that made people cross the street to avoid him. Leather and tattoos and the permanent scowl of a man who had seen too much and forgiven too little. The last thing he wanted was to frighten a child. But the girl did not run. She just watched him, her breath forming small clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Her lips had a bluish tint that set off alarms in Hank's mind. He glanced around. No car tracks. No footprints except his own, already filling with the fresh snow. Nothing but trees and the empty highway stretching into darkness in both directions. Where are your parents? He tried again, crouching down despite the pain that shot through his bad knee. The girl's eyes welled with fresh tears. She clutched whatever she was holding tighter against her chest. Okay, Hank said softer now. It is okay. But it was not okay. A child alone in a blizzard was about as far from okay as the universe could arrange. The wind picked up driving needles of ice against his face. The temperature was dropping. Night was falling fast. This was not a situation that allowed for hesitation. Listen, Hank said, taking one careful step closer. It is not safe out here. We need to get you warm. Can you tell me your name? The girl's mouth moved, but her voice was so small that the wind stole it before it reached him. What was that? He leaned in. Rosie, she whispered. Okay, Rosie, I am Hank. I have got a motorcycle right over there. I can take you someplace warm. Then we will figure out how to find your folks. He held out his hand. His knuckles were scarred and tattooed, the hands of a man who had used them as weapons more times than he could count. Not the kind of hands a child should trust. Rosie looked at them. Then she looked at his face. Whatever she saw there, whatever calculation a 4-year-old mind could perform in the space between terror and trust, she made her decision. She uncurled from her protective ball and tried to stand. Her legs buckled. She was too cold, too stiff. She fell back against the tree with a whimper that cut through Hank like a blade. He closed the distance in 2 strides. I'm going to pick you up, he said, just to get you to the bike. She did not protest. When he scooped her into his arms, she weighed almost nothing. A bird with hollow bones. Her small body trembled against his chest, shaking with a cold that had gone deep. As he lifted her, Hank got his first clear look at what she had been clutching so desperately. A photograph, worn at the edges, creased down the middle from being folded and unfolded countless times. What you got there? He asked, trying to keep his voice light as he carried her through the snow toward his motorcycle. Rosie did not answer. She pressed the photo between her small palm and his leather jacket and held on. When they reached the Harley, Hank set her down carefully, one hand on her shoulder to steady her. He needed to see that photograph. Something about the way she held it, the way she had been sitting alone in a blizzard with it pressed to her heart, told him it mattered. Can I take a look at what you have got? He asked, nodding toward the photo. Maybe it will help us figure out where you belong. Rosie searched his face with those enormous eyes. Then slowly she held out the photograph. Hank took it carefully, brushing away the snowflakes that had settled on its surface. He angled it toward the motorcycle's headlamp. The image came into focus and the ground shifted beneath his feet. A younger version of himself stared back from the photograph. Same eyes, same scar cutting through his left eyebrow, but smiling. He had his arm around a woman's shoulders. She was laughing, her head tilted slightly toward him, her hair blown sideways by a wind that had been warm and kind. Claire. Hank's throat closed. His hand trembled, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Why do you have a photo of me? He asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Rosie's small fingers reached out and touched the edge of the photograph. That is you, she said. Yeah, that is me. And that is... He could not finish. His finger hovered over Claire's face, over her smile, over the woman she had been before he abandoned her. That is my mommy, Rosie said. The words hit him like a fist to the solar plexus. The air left his lungs. He stared at the girl, truly seeing her for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her chin, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was thinking. Claire's features unmistakable now that he knew to look for them. Your mommy, he repeated. Claire is your mother, Rosie nodded. Where is she? Where is Claire? Rosie's lower lip trembled. Mommy went to heaven, she whispered. The world stopped turning. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Hank knelt in the snow beside the child, his knees sinking deep, and felt something inside him collapse that he did not know was still standing. Claire, his baby sister, the girl who used to follow him everywhere, who looked at him like he could hold back the dark. Gone, when he managed. After the leaves fell, when it got cold. Recently, this past autumn. Months ago, while Hank had been drifting through the country on his motorcycle going nowhere, caring about nothing, his sister had been dying. Rosie watched him with a steadiness that no 4-year-old should possess. "Are you Uncle Hank?" The word uncle landed on him like a stone dropped from a great height. A title he had never considered. A role he had never imagined for himself. "Yes," he said, "I am Hank. Your mom was my sister. She had your picture in her special box. She looked at it sometimes when she was sad." Hank turned away so the child would not see his face. The thought of Claire keeping his photograph all those years, looking at it in her lowest moments, broke something in him that he had believed was already broken beyond repair. He cleared his throat. "Who is taking care of you now?" "Rosie. Who are you with?" The girl went silent, her face closed like a door. "Did someone leave you here?" She shook her head. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Hank with the careful deliberateness of a child performing an important duty. It was a map, hand-drawn, worn along the creases. A route marked in red pen. Hank's stomach dropped when he recognized the endpoint. This stretch of road, this very turnout. And beneath the map in Claire's handwriting, "He rides this way every Thursday. Wait, and he will come." Hank stared at the words until they blurred. Claire had known his routine. For how long? Had she been watching him from a distance all these years, tracking his movements, knowing exactly where he would be on any given Thursday evening? The thought that she had been so close and yet had never reached out filled him with a grief so enormous it had no edges. "Did your mom tell you anything else about me? About what to do if you found me?" "She said you would keep me safe," Rosie replied, looking up at him with a trust so complete it terrified him. Hank shrugged out of his heavy leather jacket and wrapped it around her tiny frame. It swallowed her whole, making her look impossibly small, a child drowning in the armor of a man who had never protected anyone who mattered. He lifted her onto the motorcycle, guided her small arms around his waist, and told her to hold on as tight as she could. Her fingers locked together against his stomach. Not nearly enough grip, but it would have to do. He kicked the Harley to life and pulled slowly onto the road, riding more carefully than he had ever ridden in his life. Every instinct that had once served recklessness now served caution. He took the curves gently. He watched for ice. He felt her small hands against his stomach and rode as though the road itself might break if he pushed too hard. The snow was easing. The worst of the storm had passed overhead and moved east, leaving behind a landscape that glittered under the emerging stars. The road was still treacherous, still empty, but something about the clearing sky made Hank feel that the worst was not behind them, but ahead, waiting in whatever came next. Half a mile down the highway, a neon sign glowed through the swirling snow. Nadine's Diner. Hank had passed it 100 times and never stopped. Tonight, the warm yellow light in the windows looked like the only safe harbor in a drowning world. He parked close and carried Rosie inside. The bell above the door announced them. The warmth hit like a wall. Hank felt Rosie relax against his chest, her shaking easing by a fraction. An older waitress behind the counter looked up. Her name tag read Nadine. Her eyes widened at the sight of the massive tattooed biker cradling a tiny girl wrapped in a leather jacket 3 sizes too large. "Table for 2, Hank said. Nadine led them to a booth near the heating vent without comment. She brought hot chocolate with whipped cream for Rosie and black coffee for Hank, and she kept her questions to herself, though her eyes said plenty. Rosie wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at Hank over the rim. The whipped cream left a white mustache on her upper lip. She did not seem to notice. "Your mommy," Hank said carefully. "She was sick." Rosie nodded. "She had bad cells. The doctor gave her medicine that made her hair fall out. Then she got too tired to get up. Cancer. Claire had been fighting cancer and he had not known. Had not been there, had not held her hand or told her he was sorry or said goodbye. "Where were you staying after your mom passed?" Hank asked, his voice low. "With Miss Penny. She was Mommy's friend. But then a man came and she got scared and told me to run." "What man?" Rosie shook her head and picked up her spoon, stirring the hot chocolate without drinking it. Her face had closed again. The door shut tight. Hank did not press. He watched her eat the bowl of chicken noodle soup Nadine brought small spoonful by small spoonful, and he tried to piece together what had happened. Claire dies. Rosie stays with a friend. Someone shows up, someone frightening enough that the friend sends a 4-year-old into the wilderness with nothing but a photograph and a hand-drawn map. The alarm bells in his head were deafening. Rosie finished her soup and drank the hot chocolate, slowly blowing on each sip the way someone had taught her. Claire had taught her that. His sister dying of cancer, still finding time to teach her daughter to blow on hot drinks. Hank paid the check and left a tip that made Nadine's eyebrows rise. Then he carried Rosie back to the motorcycle, and they rode the remaining miles to the town where Hank kept his apartment, the girl pressed against his back, the photograph tucked safely inside the leather jacket that still surrounded her like a shell. That night in his small apartment on the second floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking, Hank gave Rosie his bed and took the couch. The apartment was spare. A worn leather sofa, a basic television, a kitchen that consisted of a hot plate and a microwave. Nothing about it said home. Nothing about it said a child should be here. Rosie stood in the bedroom doorway in a black Harley-Davidson t-shirt that hung past her knees, clutching the photograph against her chest. She looked like a small ghost haunting a room that had never known tenderness. "Good night," Hank said from the couch. Rosie did not move. "Uncle Hank, yeah, Mommy always checked for monsters." He blinked. Monsters under the bed. And in the closet, Hank got up his joints, protesting, and walked to the bedroom. He knelt and made a show of looking under the bed. "All clear down here," he reported. He opened the closet door wide. "Nothing in here either." Rosie's shoulders dropped an inch. "Thank you." He stood awkwardly by the bed, a man who had faced down armed rivals and police raids completely out of his depth in the presence of a child who needed a bedtime routine. "Anything else your mom did at night?" She sang to me. Rosie's voice was barely a whisper. "But it is okay if you cannot." Hank could not remember the last time he had sung anything. He cleared his throat and sat on the edge of the mattress. "Once upon a time," he said instead, "there was a brave knight." "Was she pretty?" He paused. "Sure, she was pretty and smart and the bravest person in the whole kingdom." "Like Mommy," Rosie murmured, pulling the covers up to her chin. "Yeah," Hank said, his voice thick. "Like your mom." He stumbled through a story about a knight who saved a village from a dragon, making it up word by word. And when he got to the ending, he said the only thing he knew to say, "And everyone lived happily ever after." "Good story," Rosie said through a yawn. "Good night, Uncle Hank." The words hung in the air like something sacred. Not just Hank, not just the man in the photograph. Uncle Hank. Family. A role he had never earned and did not deserve, and would spend whatever was left of his life trying to be worthy of. "Good night, Rosie," he whispered. He sat in the dark for a long time after she fell asleep, watching her chest rise and fall. The photograph was still clutched in her fist, pressed against her heart. He remembered Claire as a girl with pigtails and skinned knees. He remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle, chasing off the neighborhood kids who pulled her hair. He remembered the promise they had made to each other in the dark of their shared bedroom, while their father raged downstairs. "No matter what happens, we protect each other." Always. He had broken that promise so thoroughly it should have been impossible to feel it anymore. But sitting there, watching Claire's daughter breathe the old vow, rose up in him like something that had never truly died, only gone underground. Morning came in pale stripes through the blinds. Hank had not slept. He scribbled a note for Rosie and slipped out before she woke, riding his motorcycle through the cold dawn to a dingy auto shop with a faded sign that read Harmon's Repairs. Gus Harmon was a stocky man with a graying mustache and oil-stained hands, and the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to know better than to be surprised by anything. He poured coffee and listened without interruption as Hank laid out the situation. "Claire came by here once," Gus said when Hank finished. "Maybe 6 years ago. Looking for you. Would not tell me why. Just wanted to know if I had seen you around. And you told her what truth? That you had gone nomad. That nobody knew where you were half the time." Gus leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking. "She seemed scared, Hank. Not of me, of something else. Did she mention the father, the kid's father?" Gus's eyes narrowed. "She did not mention a kid, but she talked about some guy she was with. Victor something. Hale, I think. Said he was bad news. Bad how? The controlling kind. The kind that leaves marks where nobody can see them." Hank's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "There is something else," Gus said, lowering his voice. "Had a man in here about a week ago, asking about Claire, described her perfectly. Smooth talker, expensive clothes. Left his card in case I remembered anything. Gus pulled open a drawer and slid a business card across the desk. Victor Hale, private consultant, a phone number beneath the name. He is looking for the girl, Gus said, or for Claire, and he is not the type to give up. Hank stared at the card. A cold fury began to build inside him, the kind he had spent years feeding and just as many years trying to starve. Thanks, Gus. What are you going to do? Whatever I have to. Back at the apartment, Rosie was awake and watching cartoons on the floor. Her legs crossed, her hair tangled. She looked up when he walked in. You came back, she said. 3 words. They hit him harder than any blow he had ever taken. Of course she had worried. Everyone else in her life had disappeared. I said I would, he replied, and I keep my promises. Not always, whispered a voice in his head, but from now on. He knelt beside Rosie's backpack and asked if she had brought anything else with her. She laid out her possessions on the kitchen table like sacred objects, a worn teddy bear, a small blanket, a folded piece of paper. The paper was a birth certificate. Rosie Ann Donnelly. Mother Claire Jean Donnelly. Father unknown. Claire had given Rosie her own last name, not Hale's. The small defiance of a woman reclaiming her daughter from a man who had no right to her. Beneath the birth certificate was a small envelope containing a key with a tag. An address in Claire's handwriting. 1423 Pinewood Lane Apartment, 7B Oak Ridge. Hank pocketed the key and spent the next hour making calls. He arranged to borrow a car, a faded blue sedan with a slightly crooked bumper. The Harley was too recognizable, and he was beginning to understand that everything he did now had to account for the small life depending on him. That evening, Hank made dinner. It was not a complicated production. Tomato soup from a can and grilled cheese sandwiches, the extent of his culinary range. He struggled with the can opener while Rosie watched from her chair legs, swinging eyes serious. You are doing it wrong, she said. Hank glanced at her. Oh yeah, you are the cooking expert now. Mommy showed me. You have to hold it tighter. He adjusted his grip and the opener bit into the metal cutting smoothly around the edge. He poured the soup into a pot and turned on the burner, then buttered bread for the sandwiches, the butter sizzling when it hit the hot pan. The silence in the kitchen felt heavy. What did people talk about with kids? Hank's usual conversations involved motorcycle parts, territory disputes, and the kind of barroom philosophy that sounded profound at 2 in the morning and meant nothing by daylight. None of it was appropriate for small ears. You like cartoons? He tried. Rosie nodded. I like the one with the yellow sponge. Right, the sponge. Hank had no idea what she was talking about. He flipped a sandwich. The bread was golden brown and the smell of melting cheese filled the apartment with a warmth it had never known. He cut the sandwiches into triangles and set them in front of Rosie with a bowl of soup. They ate across from each other at the small kitchen table. Rosie blew carefully on each spoonful of soup before taking a tiny sip. So cautious, so precise. Claire had taught her that. His sister raising a child alone while hiding from a monster, still finding time to teach table manners. This is good, Rosie said, sounding surprised. Do not sound so shocked. I can make grilled cheese. A silence settled between them that was almost comfortable. Hank watched the girl eat and tried to reconcile the reality before him with the life he had been living. Yesterday, he had been a man with no destination and no purpose. Today, he was making grilled cheese for his 4-year-old niece. Was your mom a good cook, he asked. Rosie nodded. She made cookies and spaghetti and pancakes shaped like Mickey. Mickey Mouse, huh? Hank tried to picture Claire making shaped pancakes. The Claire he remembered had been a teenager with a rebellious streak and a laugh that could fill a room. Not a mother making Disney breakfast, but people changed. People grew into roles they never imagined for themselves. The thought carried an edge. People changed. Did your mom talk about me? The question had been burning in him since the moment Rosie spoke his name. Rosie studied him with those solemn eyes that saw too much for their age. She had your picture by her bed. She said you were her big brother and you were very strong. A pause. She said you were far away because you had important things to do. Important things, like running with a motorcycle gang, like drinking himself numb in roadside bars, like cutting off the only person who had ever truly loved him. Some important things, Hank said, and the bitterness in his voice surprised him. But you are here now, Rosie said simply. The observation hit him with the force of a reckoning. He was here now. Too late for Claire, but not too late for this girl with her mother's eyes and her mother's quiet courage. After dinner, Hank washed dishes while Rosie dried her hands on a towel too large for her. She yawned and rubbed her eyes. Bedtime, Hank said. Can I have a story? I do not have any kid books. Mommy made up stories. I am not good at that kind of thing, kid. Rosie's face fell and Hank felt like he had kicked something small and defenseless. He sighed, but I guess I could try. She brightened immediately and Hank helped her into the blue star pajamas they had bought that afternoon and tucked her into bed. Once upon a time, he began sitting on the edge of the mattress. There was a brave night. Was she pretty? He paused, then smiled. Sure, she was pretty and smart and braver than anyone in the whole kingdom. Like Mommy. Yeah, like your mom. Exactly like your mom. He stumbled through a story about a knight saving a village from a dragon, making it up word by word, and when he got to the ending, he said the only thing he knew to say, and everyone lived happily ever after. Good story, Rosie said through a yawn. Her eyes closed, then fluttered open once more. Good night, Uncle Hank. Good night, Rosie, he whispered. The next morning, Hank took Rosie to a neighborhood park. It was not much, just a small playground, with swings and a slide and a climbing structure surrounded by benches and bare trees. At this hour on a weekday, they had it to themselves. Go ahead, Hank said, nodding toward the playground. Rosie hesitated, looking from him to the swings and back again. It is okay. I will be right here. She made her way to the swings, climbed onto one, and looked back at him. Can you push me? Hank walked over, feeling like a man entering a foreign country without a map. He gave the swing a gentle push. When she swung back, he pushed again a little more firmly. Then again. Higher, Rosie called. He obliged carefully, gauging each push, and soon she was soaring, her hair streaming behind her like a small flag. And then he heard it. A sound he had not expected and was not prepared for. Laughter. Rosie was laughing. The sound was bright and clear and full of a joy so uncomplicated it made his chest ache. Look at me, she called. I see you, Hank answered, and meant it in ways she could not yet understand. For the next hour, he sat on a bench and watched her discover the playground. She went down the slide, sitting up, then lying back with her arms over her head. She climbed the rope ladder and waved from the top like a conquering explorer. She jumped from the lowest platform and landed with bent knees exactly as he had shown her. Her face had changed. No longer so solemn, but animated, flushed with exertion, and cold in simple pleasure. She was a child, being a child perhaps for the first time in months, and watching it happen did something to Hank that he could not name and did not want to examine too closely. He imagined mornings like this stretching into the future. Pancakes, maybe blueberries, weekends at this park, teaching her to ride a bicycle, homework at the kitchen table, a life built around something other than survival. Can we come back tomorrow? Rosie asked, breathless, standing in front of his bench. Yeah, he said, we can come back tomorrow. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when Hank noticed them. Two men near the park entrance, half hidden behind an oak tree, one in a dark jacket with the collar turned up, the other leaning against the trunk, pretending to check his phone but glancing up too often. Hank's instincts fired. 20 years with the club had wired his nervous system to detect surveillance the way a rabbit detects a hawk. Rosie, he called, keeping his voice casual. Time to go, kiddo. All ready? Yeah, we need to grab some things before we head home. He took her hand and guided her toward the side exit away from the men. They played a game he invented on the spot, quick steps, big strides without running. Rosie giggled, taking exaggerated steps that made her wobble. Under different circumstances, it might have been funny. At the car, he buckled her in and pulled away with forced calm. In the rearview mirror, one of the men took a photo of his license plate. Hank drove for 20 minutes, making random turns, watching for tails. By the time he was satisfied they were not being followed, the sun was setting and Rosie had fallen asleep in her booster seat, her head lolled to one side, her small hand resting on her teddy bear. He carried her upstairs, locked the door, pulled the blinds, and sat in the gathering dark with the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. Victor Hale had found them. The men at the park were his. The license plate photo meant they would be tracked, identified, located. The clock was running now. The next day they drove to Oak Ridge. Rosie sat in a booster seat Hank had purchased at a department store on their way out of town, watching the world pass by her window with quiet fascination. She pointed at eyes in bright-colored houses and a mailbox shaped like a fish, and each time she pointed, Hank felt something loosen in the knot that had lived in his chest for 12 years. The simple act of driving somewhere with a child in the back seat, of being responsible for another heartbeat, was rewriting the meaning of every mile. The apartment building on Pinewood Lane was modest but well-maintained, with small flower beds lining the walkway and clean windows that caught the afternoon light. It looked like the kind of place where people hung curtains and watered plants and lived quiet lives. It looked nothing like a hiding place. An elderly woman walking a small white dog approached the entrance just as Hank and Rosie reached it. She eyed Hank with the wariness his appearance always inspired, but then her gaze fell on the little girl at his side and her entire demeanor changed. "Oh my goodness," she said, one hand flying to her mouth. "Is that little Rosie Claire's girl?" Hank tensed. "You knew Claire. I am Mrs. Bellamy from 6B, the woman said, already kneeling down with the careful effort of someone whose knees no longer cooperated fully. "I used to watch this angel when her mother worked late shifts. Hello, sweetheart. Do you remember me? I made you those chocolate chip cookies." Rosie nodded shyly, stepping half behind Hank's leg, but offering a small smile that told Hank she remembered more than she could articulate. Mrs. Bellamy straightened up, and the brightness in her face gave way to concern. "I have not seen Claire in months. Is she all right?" Hank looked down at Rosie, then back at the old woman. "Claire passed away recently," he said quietly. "Cancer. I am her brother. I am looking after Rosie now." Mrs. Bellamy's hand went to her heart. She stood very still for a moment, the wind moving her silver hair, and Hank watched a grief cross her face that was genuine and deep, in the way that only comes from losing someone whose kindness had been a steady light in your daily life. She let them into Claire's old apartment with a spare key. The rooms were empty except for larger furniture the landlord had not yet removed. A small table, a worn couch, a bed frame without a mattress. The walls still held the ghost marks of pictures that had once hung there. Nail holes, faint rectangles of lighter paint where frames had blocked the sun. Rosie wandered through the rooms, slowly touching the walls as if searching for something she could not name. Hank watched her and felt the absence of Claire like a physical force, a vacuum where a life had been. Mrs. Bellamy sent Rosie downstairs for cookies, and when the child was gone, the old woman's face hardened with the gravity of what she needed to say. "Your sister was terrified of someone. She never told me his name, but I could see it in everything she did. She checked the locks twice every night. She would not stand near windows after dark. She jumped when someone knocked on the door unexpectedly. Once I came up to return a dish, and when I knocked, I heard her scream before she realized it was me. A man came looking for her about a year ago." Mrs. Bellamy continued. "Charming fellow on the surface. Wore a nice coat, brought flowers, said he was an old friend. But something in his eyes was wrong, Mr. Donnelly, something flat and hungry. When I told Claire about his visit, the color drained from her face so completely I thought she might faint. That was the night she started packing. How many times did she move? 3 times in the 2 years I knew her. Always suddenly. Always in the middle of the night. The last time was the worst. I heard them leaving at 3 in the morning. I came out to say goodbye, and Claire was carrying Rosie with one hand and a single suitcase with the other. She told me that if anyone ever came asking about her, I should say I never knew where she had gone." Mrs. Bellamy's voice dropped. Whatever it was she was running from, it was real. I have never seen that kind of fear in a person's eyes. Not before and not since. The drive to St. Mary's Church took 20 minutes. The building was modest white clapboard siding, a simple steeple reaching toward the late afternoon sky. Inside evening light filtered through stained glass and painted the wooden pews in soft, shifting colors. Pastor Jim Whitfield was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the steady bearing of someone who had spent decades listening to the worst things people could endure and responding with grace. He recognized Rosie instantly and knelt to greet her with a warmth that told Hank the child had been loved here. When Rosie was settled with the Sunday school teacher and a stack of coloring books, Pastor Jim led Hank to his office. Books lined every wall. A worn desk held an open Bible and stacks of paper. "Claire came to us through our program for women escaping domestic violence," the pastor said. "She was one of the bravest people I have ever known. She endured things that would have broken most people, and she did it all to protect that little girl. He hurt her, Hank said. It was not a question. Yes, and she feared he would hurt Rosie. That was the line that she would not allow to be crossed. The pastor paused, studying Hank's face as if weighing how much to reveal. Whenever Claire spoke about her fears about the danger she lived with, she always ended with the same thought. She believed that someday when things were at their darkest, you would come. She had absolute faith that her brother would save her when she needed him most. She was wrong, Hank said. I came too late. Pastor Jim shook his head gently. You came exactly when you were needed. Your sister is gone, and that is a grief you will carry. But Rosie is here because of Claire's faith in you. The question now is what you do with that faith. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small worn Bible. She left this here, he said, handing it to Hank. I have been keeping it for her. I think she would want you to have it now. Hank took the Bible, turning it over in his hands. It felt foreign and familiar at the same time, the way family does when you have been away too long. The county social services building was a gray box under fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. A woman named Karen Prescott sat behind a desk piled with files and met Hank's eyes with the directness of someone who dealt in hard truths for a living. She opened a thick folder and confirmed what every conversation that day had been building toward. Claire had sought emergency protection 3 years ago. She had a restraining order against Victor Hale. She had been moving constantly, changing phones, living in a state of perpetual flight. What kind of man is he? Hank asked. Karen met his eyes. Dangerous, controlling, violent when crossed. He has a record of assault charges, but he has money and good lawyers. He has avoided serious jail time. And he does not just use his fists, he uses the system. He has attorneys who know how to turn custody disputes into weapons. He understands how to present himself in court, how to appear reasonable while making your life impossible. She paused. He was here 2 days ago, demanding information about Claire and the child. Said he had parental rights. Security had to escort him out. He was calm about it, polished. But I have been in this work for 15 years, mister. Donnelly and I know what danger looks like when it wears a good suit. And then she said something that made the hair on the back of Hank's neck stand up. Your sister listed you as Rosie's guardian in her emergency plan. She trusted you, even after all the years apart. Karen leaned forward across her desk. But Mr. Donnelly, you should understand something. Victor Hale will not stop. Men like him see children as possessions, as property, and he will use every resource he has to get what he considers his. If he discovers you have Rosie, you will both be in danger. Hank returned from the social services building late that afternoon with his mind on fire. Karen Prescott's words echoed in his head like a warning siren. Victor Hale does not just use fists, he uses the system. Mrs. Kovacs, the elderly widow across the hall, had watched Rosie while Hank was out. She had braided the girl's hair and fed her lunch and asked no questions beyond the ones a kind person asks a child. Hank thanked her and meant it more than he could express. Back in his apartment, Rosie fell asleep on the couch with a cartoon show, murmuring softly from the television. She had curled into a ball with a throw pillow clutched to her chest, and even in sleep, her face held the tension of a child who had learned that rest was never truly safe. Hank sat at the kitchen table and spread out everything he had gathered. The birth certificate, the key, Gus's information and the business card, his own scribbled notes, the pieces of Claire's hidden life arranged like evidence at a trial that had come 12 years too late. He thought about the apartment on Pinewood Lane, the nail holes in the walls where pictures had once hung, the ghost marks of a life dismantled in the middle of the night. He thought about Claire carrying Rosie with one hand and a suitcase with the other, fleeing into darkness. He thought about the fear in Mrs. Bellamy's voice when she described the man with flowers and flat, hungry eyes. And he thought about himself, where he had been during all of it, on the road, on his motorcycle, running from nothing toward nothing, burning fuel in years, while his sister fought a war on 2 fronts, a disease that was killing her body, and a man who had been killing her spirit long before the cancer came. The guilt was a physical thing. It sat on his chest like an anvil. It filled his throat like smoke. If he had answered one phone call, if he had opened one letter, if he had swallowed his pride and driven to wherever she was and said the 2 words that mattered, I am sorry, everything might have been different. She might have had someone to drive her to chemotherapy. someone to sit beside her bed when the treatments made her too weak to stand, someone to hold Rosie when Claire could not hold her anymore. But he had not done any of those things. He had ridden his motorcycle through empty landscapes and called it freedom, when all along it had been cowardice dressed in leather. That night, Hank sat in darkness while Rosie slept. The information he had gathered formed a picture so clear it burned. Claire had spent years running from a man who had hurt her, hiding their daughter, moving from apartment to apartment, dying slowly of cancer while trying to keep Rosie safe. She had never asked Hank for help. She had simply prepared for the possibility that one day he would need to give it. He pulled out the photograph and held it near the lamp on the kitchen counter. Then he remembered something from their childhood, a trick they had used to pass secret messages when their father was checking their notes. Writing with lemon juice that turned visible when heated. Hank struck a match and held the flame carefully beneath the back of the photograph. Slowly, like ghosts rising from paper, words appeared in Claire's small, precise handwriting. Hank, if you are reading this, I could not keep her safe anymore. I have always watched you from afar. You think you are lost to darkness, but I have seen your light. The men who follow you would die for you. That is not fear. That is love. You have strength no one else has, not just to fight, but to protect. You are the only one I trust with her. She needs a guardian, not just a parent. I believe in who you are, not what you have done. Remember the promise we made as children. It is time. Love always. Claire. Hank read the message 3 times. His vision blurred and he did not wipe his eyes. The promise to protect each other, no matter what. He looked over at Rosie, a small shape under heavy covers, her face peaceful in sleep, the photograph's twin still clutched in her small fist. Claire had been watching him all these years, believing in him when he had given up on himself, seeing light where he saw nothing but ash. She had trusted him with the most precious thing in her life. I will not let you down, Hank whispered. Not this time. The words were both a prayer and a vow, and the first true thing he had said in 12 years. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky had cleared to reveal a field of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. And in the silence of the apartment, something shifted in Hank Donnelly. A purpose began to take root in ground that had been barren for so long he had forgotten anything could grow there. Claire had seen something in him worth trusting. Now he had to become worthy of that trust. He closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair, the photograph resting on his chest, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight he carried felt like something he could bear. Not lighter, not gone, but shaped differently. Shared with the memory of a sister who had loved him through everything, and with the sleeping child who had inherited that love, like a torch passed in the dark. Hank drifted into something that was not quite sleep, but was the closest he had come to peace in 12 years. The apartment was still. The night was quiet. Rosie's breathing was a soft, steady rhythm from the bedroom, and the world beyond the walls had gone silent under a blanket of fresh snow. Then in the dead of night, a sound cut through the stillness. 3 slow knocks on the apartment door. Hank's eyes snapped open. Every nerve in his body went taut. His hand reached instinctively for the baseball bat leaning against the wall. He moved silently to the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, clean-cut, well-dressed, an expensive coat draped over broad shoulders. A smile on his face that was all surface and no warmth. The kind of smile that had probably charmed 1,000 people and fooled every one of them except the ones who knew what it cost. I know you are in there, Hank, the man said softly through the door. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and could not imagine a world where that might change. Let us talk like adults. Hank stood frozen. Behind him down the short hallway, Rosie slept peacefully, unaware that the man her mother had spent years running from had just arrived at their door. I am Victor Hale, the man continued, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk. Hank stood in the dark, one hand on the bat, the other pressed flat against the door, and felt the ground beneath his feet begin to tremble with the weight of everything that was about to come. Hank slowly opened the door, keeping the chain lock fastened. Through the narrow gap, he faced Victor Hale for the first time. The man before him looked nothing like the monster Hank had constructed in his imagination. Victor was well-built, polished, wearing an overcoat that cost more than everything in Hank's apartment combined. His hair was neatly combed. His shoes were clean despite the snow outside. He had the look of a man who moved through the world expecting it to accommodate him, and it usually did. But Hank had spent 2 decades reading men the way sailors read weather. He recognized the cold calculation behind those pleasant features. He had seen that same look in men just before violence erupted the stillness of a predator, deciding whether to strike or wait. "What do you want?" Hank asked, though the answer was already a knot in his stomach. "I think you know," Victor said, still smiling. "My daughter, I have been looking everywhere for her since her mother passed. You can imagine my concern." "Funny," Hank replied, his voice flat. "From what I hear, you were not too concerned before Claire died." The smile flickered, a single frame of something raw and ugly before the mask reassembled itself. "Family matters can be complicated. I do not expect a man like you to understand. Rosie needs her father. She needs safety," Hank said. "She needs someone who will not hurt her." Victor's pleasant expression peeled away like paint in a fire. "You do not know the first thing about me or my relationship with my family. You are a biker with a record." "What are you?" The uncle, the one Claire used to talk about, the dangerous one she was afraid of. The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. But Hank held his face neutral. "I am the one she trusted with her daughter." Victor stepped closer to the gap in the door, and his voice dropped to something intimate and venomous. "That is not how the police will see it, Mr. Donnelly. What do you think happens when I report that my daughter was kidnapped by a Hell's Angel? A quick search of your name brings up quite the resume. Assault, suspected weapons charges, known gang affiliations." Hank tightened his grip on the bat behind the door. "There are reasons Claire kept Rosie away from you. Accusations from a dead woman," Victor said with a shrug that was calculated to look casual and instead looked reptilian. "Sadly, people believe what they want to believe. And most people find it easier to believe a successful businessman over a biker with blood on his hands. You are not taking her." Victor leaned so close that Hank could smell his cologne through the gap in the door. Something expensive. Something that it would linger in a room long after the man who wore it had done his damage and left. "Let me make something very clear," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will have my daughter back. You can cooperate, or I can make your life a living hell. I have resources. I have connections. By tomorrow afternoon, there will be an Amber Alert with your name and your description. Your face will be on every news channel. You will be hunted by people who shoot first and ask questions after." "You are threatening the wrong person," Hank growled. "No," Victor replied with certainty as cold and smooth as a frozen lake. "I am threatening exactly the right person. Because you care about her, do you not? And that is your weakness. Men like you think caring makes you strong. It does not. It makes you predictable." Hank's hand moved toward the chain. Every muscle in his body wanted to rip the door open and end this man permanently. One quick violent moment, and the threat would be gone. He had done worse for lesser reasons. He had broken bones for insults. He had put men in hospitals for looking at him wrong. This was different. This was personal. This was about a child. Then he heard it, a small sound from down the hallway. Rosie stirring in her sleep. A soft murmur, a name spoken into the darkness of a dream. "Mommy." The sound traveled through Hank like electricity. Claire's message flashed through his mind. Protection, not violence. His hand froze on the chain. Victor noticed the hesitation and smiled the way a man smiles when he finds the crack in a wall he has been studying. "Smart man. Think about it overnight. I will be in touch tomorrow." Victor straightened his coat, adjusted his collar, and walked calmly down the hallway toward the stairs. His footsteps were unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had all the time in the world because he believed he had already won. Hank closed the door and leaned his forehead against it, trembling. Not with fear, though fear was there. Trembling with the effort of restraint, with the war between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Victor knew where they were. The threat was real and immediate. And for the first time in years, Hank Donnelly was truly afraid. Not for himself. He had stopped being afraid for himself a long time ago. He was afraid for the little girl sleeping 20 feet away who trusted him to keep her safe. He did not sleep. He paced the apartment in the dark, checking locks, peering through blinds, running scenarios. By dawn, he had a plan. They would leave. Today. He would pack what they needed and drive north. He had contacts who could get them across the border. New names, new identities, a clean start in a place where Victor Hale's money and connections meant nothing. Morning light crept into the kitchen. Hank stood at the stove frying eggs in his only pan. The smell of coffee filled the apartment. Behind him, Rosie sat at the table coloring with the crayons he had bought her face serious with concentration. "You want toast?" he asked over his shoulder. Rosie nodded. "With butter, please." Something about the politeness, the careful manners, that Claire had woven into this child despite everything made Hank's resolve harden. He would protect this girl. He would give her the life Claire had wanted for her, even if it meant running forever. "Uncle Hank, yeah, kiddo. Can I bring my crayons when we go?" She had heard his late-night phone calls. She understood more than any 4-year-old should have to understand. "Of course you can. We will pack everything up after breakfast." The toaster popped. Hank reached for the butter. A sharp knock rattled the door. His body tensed instantly. His hand moved toward the knife on the counter. Maintenance called, a muffled voice from the hallway. "Got a report of a water leak from the apartment below." It was barely 7 in the morning. Too early for building maintenance. Hank moved quietly to the peephole. A man in coveralls cap pulled low toolbox in hand. "Not a good time," Hank called through the door. "Come back later." "Sir, if there is a leak, water damage could spread to other units." Building manager said to check immediately. Every warning signal in Hank's nervous system fired at once. "Leave the toolbox. I will check it myself." Silence. Then footsteps retreating. Hank turned back toward Rosie. The kitchen window exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the floor in a shower of fragments that caught the morning light like 1,000 tiny blades. A figure lunged through the opening, and before Hank could close the distance, a bolt of electricity slammed into his chest. The taser dropped him. His muscles seized. His legs gave way. He hit the floor hard enough to crack his teeth together, and the world became a shaking, strobing nightmare of paralysis and pain. Through blurred vision, he saw a second man climb through the broken window. And then Victor Hale stepped carefully over the sill, brushing glass from his sleeves like a man brushing lint from a suit. "Rosie, sweetheart." Victor called, his voice sickly sweet against the backdrop of destruction. "Time to go with Daddy." Hank fought against the paralysis. His fingers scraped against the linoleum. His body refused to obey. "Run." He managed to gasp, but the word came out shattered, barely a sound at all. Rosie sat frozen at the table. Her crayon had fallen from her hand. Her eyes were enormous, locked on Hank convulsing on the floor. "Do not be scared," Princess Victor said, crossing the kitchen with the calm of a man walking through his own living room. "This man took you away from me. I have been looking everywhere for you." The taser's effects were fading. Sensation returned like fire crawling through his veins. Hank lunged forward and grabbed at Victor's ankle. Victor kicked hard. His shoe connected with Hank's temple with a sound like a wet stone dropped on concrete. Stars exploded across his vision. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead, running into his eyes, turning the world red. Uncle Hank Rosie screamed, and the sound of her terror was the worst thing Hank had ever heard in a life that had not been short on terrible sounds. She slid from her chair and tried to run to him, but Victor caught her easily, lifting her as she kicked and thrashed with every ounce of strength her small body possessed. "Let her go!" Hank roared, staggering to his feet, blood dripping, the room tilting. Victor backed toward the window, Rosie struggling in his arms, her screams cutting through the morning air. "You made this harder than it needed to be," he said, and there was no smile now. No charm, just the cold face of a man who had gotten what he came for and no longer needed his mask. The accomplice appeared at the window. He took Rosie from Victor. The transfer was smooth, practiced, like a package being handed off. Rosie's screams grew louder, then muffled, then distant as they carried her down the fire escape. Hank lunged. Something hard and metallic crashed against the base of his skull. The world spun. He felt himself falling, his hands reaching for nothing, his knees hitting the floor, his cheeks striking the cold linoleum. Through fading consciousness, he heard Rosie's voice. "Uncle Hank, help me, please." And then a car engine starting outside. And then nothing. Hank came to with a jolt. Dried blood had crusted along the side of his face, pulling at his skin when he moved. For a moment, the world was white noise and confusion. Then memory returned like a hammer blow. Rosie was gone. He pushed himself off the floor, fighting waves of dizziness that pulled at him like undertow. Glass crunched beneath his boots. The apartment was silent except for the drip of the kitchen faucet. The eggs had burned black in the pan. The toast sat cold and forgotten. Rosie's coloring book lay open on the table, a half-finished picture of a house with a purple door. How long had he been out? The light through the broken window had changed. Hours. Hours while Victor Hale drove Rosie farther and farther away. Hank stumbled to the bathroom and ran cold water over his face. The mirror showed a man who looked like he had been dragged behind a truck. Bloodshot eyes, a deep gash on his temple, an expression of devastation so complete it did not look like a face anymore. It looked like a landscape after a fire. He had failed. Failed Claire. Failed Rosie. Failed the promise he had made in the dark. Back in the kitchen, his gaze fell on the table where Rosie had been sitting. Her drawing lay abandoned. Two stick figures holding hands. A big one and a little one. Beneath them, in the careful, wobbly letters of a child just learning to write, she had attempted two words, Uncle Hank. He picked up the drawing with trembling fingers and pressed it against his chest. Then he slumped into her chair and sat there for a long time, staring at the broken window and the empty room and the ruins of everything he had just begun to build. On the floor nearby lay the photograph that had started it all. He reached down and lifted it, rubbing his thumb across the worn image of his younger self smiling beside Claire. A man who had not yet become the wreckage he was now. "I am sorry, Claire," he whispered. "I could not protect her." For years, Hank had lived by a code built on violence and retribution. The Hells Angels had taught him how to hurt people, how to instill fear, how to reduce complex problems to their simplest, brutal solution. He had walked away from that life slowly, never completely, but enough that he had started to believe he could become someone different. Now sitting in his wrecked apartment with Rosie's screams still echoing in his skull, he wondered if turning away from violence had been his greatest mistake. "I should have killed him the moment I saw his face." Hank muttered, his fingers tightening on the photograph. "I hesitated. I listened to words on the back of a picture, and I hesitated, and now she is gone." The hesitation had cost him everything. If he had been the man he used to be, ruthless, and feared, Victor Hale would never have walked out of that hallway alive. Rosie would still be safe, coloring at the table, asking for toast with butter. Something Karen Prescott had mentioned came back to him. Victor Hale has a family cabin somewhere in the mountains. About 2 hours north. Claire mentioned it once. Said it was where he took her when things got bad. Hank stood up slowly. He tucked Rosie's drawing into his pocket and the photograph into his wallet. He moved to the hallway closet with the deliberateness of a man performing a ritual. Behind his regular clothes hung the leather vest he had not worn in months. He pulled it out and ran his fingers over the patches and insignia. The name Stone was embroidered across the back in letters that had once meant something powerful and terrible. The Hank who had found Rosie under a tree in a snowstorm. The Hank who had made her pancakes and checked for monsters and told clumsy bedtime stories. That Hank could not save her. That man was too soft, too slow, too burdened by a conscience that Victor Hale did not possess. He needed to become stone again. He slid the vest on. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like an old skin. Then he knelt and reached under his bed, pulling out a metal lockbox. The key had hung around his neck for years, one of those habits that outlast the life it belongs to. He opened the box and stared at the contents. A handgun, 2 loaded magazines. "I am sorry, Claire," he whispered as he lifted the weapon, "but I do not know any other way." He checked the gun with practiced ease. The muscle memory was immediate and complete, as though the years between then and now had been nothing more than a long intermission. He loaded the weapon chambered around and tucked it into the waistband of his jeans. The cold metal against his spine was familiar. It felt like coming home to a house he had sworn to leave. Hank rode the borrowed sedan north. The gun sat in his lap. The mountains rose around him. The road climbed through dense forest, winding along ridgelines that overlooked valleys still white with the last of winter snow. He pulled over at a turnout on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The engine ticked as it cooled. Below him, waves crashed against the rocks with a sound like the world breathing. He sat there for a long time with the gun in his hands and the photograph beside him and the drawing in his pocket and the full weight of what he was about to do pressing down on his chest. He was going to find the cabin. He was going to walk through the door. He was going to put 2 bullets in Victor Hale and carry Rosie out. And then he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, and Rosie would be alone again, and everything Claire had hoped for would die with her brother's last act of violence. The plan was clear. It was simple. It was exactly what the old Hank the man called Stone would have done without hesitation. But Hank turned the photograph over and read Claire's words again. You have strength no one else has, not just to fight, but to protect. She needs a guardian, not just a parent. I believe in who you are, not what you have done, Erbaman. He pulled Rosie's drawing from his pocket. Two stick figures, big one and little one. Uncle Hank, written in a 4-year-old's uncertain hand. If he killed Victor, he would go to prison. Rosie would enter the foster system. Everything Claire had sacrificed, every night she had run, every plan she had made, every message she had hidden would amount to nothing. Victor Hale wins, not because he is alive, but because Hank will have become exactly what Victor always said he was. A violent criminal, a danger to children, proof that a Hell's Angel cannot change. Protection, Hank said aloud and his voice broke on the word. Not destruction. He ejected the magazine. He racked the slide and caught the chambered round. He locked both in the glove compartment and sat there empty-handed, staring at the ocean. The waves did not care about his rage. The cliffs did not care about his grief. The world was vast and indifferent, and the only thing that mattered was a 4-year-old girl in a cabin somewhere in these mountains who believed her uncle would come for her. Not Stone, not the feared biker with blood on his hands. Uncle Hank, the man who checked for monsters and burned the eggs and told bad stories about brave knights. Hank pulled out his phone and scrolled to a name he had not called in 5 years. Detective Ray Beckett, a man who had once tried to pull him back from the edge when no one else would. A man who carried a badge instead of a blade and believed in a system that Hank had spent his whole life working against. His finger hovered over the name. Calling Ray meant no going back. It meant choosing a different path, one that was slower and harder and uncertain. A path that required trust in people and institutions he had never trusted. A path that meant surrendering control. He thought of Rosie's face, her quiet voice calling him Uncle Hank. The way she had looked at him when she said you would keep me safe. He thought of Claire's faith. Faith he had not earned but wanted with every broken piece of himself to deserve. He pressed the call button. The phone rang 3 times. Beckett said a gruff voice, "Hey Ray, it is Hank, Hank Donnelly." A pause that lasted long enough for history to fill the space between them. "Stone, it has been what, 5 years, Hank?" he corrected. "I am Hank now." Another pause. "Okay, Hank, what can I do for you?" Hank took a deep breath. The ocean crashed below him. The wind moved through the pine trees. Claire's photograph lay on the passenger seat, face down, her hidden message pressed against the leather. "I need your help," Hank said. "There is a little girl who needs protection. My niece, and I want to do this the right way." As he spoke, explaining the situation in sentences that came easier than he expected, Hank felt something shift inside him. A weight lifting, a path clearing. Not simpler, not safer, but right. The kind of right that does not need justification because it justifies itself. He would get Rosie back. Not as Stone, not with a gun, but as Hank Donnelly, the man his sister had always believed he could be. The man who fights not by destroying what threatens, but by building what protects. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, heading toward the police station, toward a world he had spent his entire life avoiding. And for the first time, the road ahead did not feel like a road to nowhere. It felt like the road home. Detective Ray Beckett's office was small, cluttered, and lit by the kind of fluorescent light that makes even healthy people look like they have not slept in a week. Hank sat in the visitor's chair, his large frame looking out of place among the file cabinets and computer monitors. He had removed his leather jacket, and beneath it, he wore a plain gray t-shirt that made him look almost ordinary. Almost. Ray Beckett was a man built for his profession. Salt and pepper hair cropped close, tired eyes that had seen every kind of human cruelty and still managed to carry something resembling compassion and the kind of patience that comes from 20 years of building cases piece by piece while the clock ran down and the stakes got higher. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, and listened without interrupting as Hank laid out the story from the beginning. The snowstorm, the girl under the tree, the photograph, the hidden message, Claire's death, Victor Hale, the confrontation at the door. the kidnapping. When Hank finished, the silence in the office lasted a long time. When you called, Ray said, "Finally, I figured it had to be serious. You were not exactly a fan of police stations last time we spoke." "Things change," Hank said quietly. "People change." Ray studied him. "So tell me about this niece of yours." Hank pulled out the photograph and handed it across the desk. Ray examined both sides, running his thumb over the faded writing on the back. "My sister wrote that," Hank explained. "She died of cancer a few weeks ago, left behind her daughter Rosie, 4 years old." And the father, Hank's jaw tightened. Victor Hale, successful businessman on paper, abuser behind closed doors. Claire spent years hiding from him. When she got sick and knew she was dying, she made sure Rosie knew how to find me. And Victor has taken the girl. Broke into my apartment this morning, tased me, knocked me out, took her. Ray made notes on a yellow legal pad, his handwriting small and precise. "Why did you not come to us immediately when you found the girl?" Hank met his eyes. "My first instinct was not to call the police. Old habits. You were going to handle it yourself." "Yes." With a gun, Hank did not flinch from the question. The thought crossed my mind. What changed? Hank reached across the desk and tapped the photograph the side with Claire's hidden message. "My sister. She did not ask me to be violent. She asked me to be a protector. There is a difference, and I almost missed it." Ray nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "Tell me everything you know about Hale. Where he might take the girl, where he lives, works, who he knows." For the next hour, Hank laid out every piece of information he had gathered. The addresses Claire had lived at, the restraining order, Karen Prescott's files, Gus Harmon's account of Victor showing up at the auto shop, Mrs. Bellamy's description of the man with flowers and flat eyes, the church, the shelter program, the documentation Claire had kept, and most importantly, the cabin. "His family has property in the mountains," Shines, Hank said, pointing to an area on the map Ray had spread across his desk. "About 2 hours north. Remote. No neighbors. Claire mentioned it once to the social worker. Said it was where Victor took her when he wanted to be sure no one would hear." Ray pulled the map closer, tracing the mountain roads with his finger. "County records will have the exact location. Property in the family name, his grandfather's. Been in the family for decades." Ray reached for his phone. "I am bringing in my lieutenant and our child services liaison. We can get a search warrant for the cabin and an emergency custody order based on the restraining order and the documentation your sister left." He paused, looking at Hank with an expression that was part caution and part respect. "This is the right way, Hank. The legal way. The way that ends with Rosie safe and Victor behind bars, not the other way around." "I know," Hank said. "That is why I am here." Ray stood up. "My team is assembling in the conference room. We will need you there to answer questions about the property, the approach, anything you know about Hale's behavior patterns." As they walked down the hallway together, their boots clicking on the linoleum in different rhythms, Ray glanced sideways at his old acquaintance. "Never thought I would see the day when Hank Stone Donnelly would be working with cops." Hank's lips curved slightly. "Neither did I." The conference room was bright and organized, a controlled chaos of professionals doing what they had been trained to do. Officers clustered around a table covered with maps, laptops, and satellite imagery. Hank stood slightly apart, still feeling the pull of a lifetime spent on the other side of the law. But he stayed. For Rosie, for Claire, for the man he had promised to become. A female officer waved him over. "Mr. Donnelly, we need you to identify these locations." Hank stepped forward. He pointed out the roads. He knew the terrain he had ridden through on his motorcycle, the approaches to the mountain area where the cabin would be. His knowledge of the landscape, accumulated through years of riding, was detailed and specific. The officers exchanged looks of quiet surprise. They had expected a biker. They had gotten an asset. Over the next 2 hours, the plan took shape. County records confirmed the cabin's exact location registered to Hale's grandfather's estate. Cell tower data showed a phone registered to Victor Hale had been in the area for several hours. The signal was stationary. "He is there," Ray said, pointing to the blinking dot on a digital map. "With Rosie." The tactical team leader, a tall man named Lieutenant Grayson, with a military bearing and calm, precise voice, laid out the approach. Single-story structure, 2 exits, front and back, 3 visible windows, dense tree cover surrounding the property with limited open ground on approach. We go in at 2200 hours, Grayson said. Full darkness gives us cover. We establish a perimeter, confirm the child's presence, and make contact. Our priority is the safe recovery of the minor. Everything else is secondary. Hank listened, his hands flat on the table, his focus absolute. He had been part of tactical operations before, though never on this side of them. The discipline was different, measured, purposeful, no rage, no vendetta, just precision aimed at a single objective: bring Rosie home. Ray pulled him aside as the briefing wound down. Hank, I need to be clear about something. You are here because you have been helpful, but when we move in, I stay in the car. Hank finished the words bitter. I know. Ray considered him for a long moment. Actually, I was going to say you can come to the staging area, but you stay with me and follow every order exactly. One step out of line and you are in handcuffs until this is over. Hank blinked. You are letting me come? I have been doing this long enough to know that if I do not, you will follow us anyway. Ray's expression softened slightly. Besides, when we get Rosie out safely, she is going to need a familiar face. Someone she trusts. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. This could still go sideways. Ray handed him a bulletproof vest. Hank held it, feeling its weight, so different from the leather vest he had worn for 2 decades. That vest had been armor for a man looking for a fight. This one was armor for a man trying to prevent one. He strapped it on. The hours crawled. Hank sat in a plastic chair in the hallway outside the conference room, drinking bad coffee from a paper cup, watching officers move with quiet urgency. He checked his phone. No messages. He checked the time. He checked his phone again. He thought about Rosie. Was she afraid? Was she crying? Had Victor hurt her? The thoughts were a kind of torture more effective than anything the physical world had ever done to him. He had been beaten, stabbed, shot at, left for dead on the side of a road. None of it compared to the helplessness of not knowing whether a 4-year-old girl was safe. He pulled out the photograph and studied Claire's face. She was laughing in the picture, her head tilted toward him, her hair caught by the wind. She looked young and unbroken and full of a future that had not yet betrayed her. I am coming, Claire, he whispered. I am doing it your way. At 9 o'clock, the team began to move. Vehicles loaded in the underground garage, dark sedans, and an unmarked van, no sirens, no lights. Hank rode shotgun with Ray in an unmarked car near the back of the convoy. The night was cold and clear, the sky crowded with stars that seemed indifferent to the urgency below them. They drove in silence for most of the trip. The road climbed into the mountains, winding through forests so dense the headlights barely penetrated. Hank stared out the window, his jaw set, his hands resting on his knees. You know, Ray said without taking his eyes off the road, I always thought you would end up dead or in prison. Never thought I would see you in a squad car heading to rescue a kid. Hank said nothing for a moment. Then, makes 2 of us. What changed, really changed? Hank thought about the question. The honest answer was complex, a tangle of guilt and grief and a letter written in lemon juice and a child's drawing and the sound of a small voice calling his name. But the simplest version was also the truest. I found out I was somebody's uncle, he said. Ray nodded as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. They reached the staging area at 10:15. A dirt pullout 100 yards from the cabin, shielded from view by a bend in the road and heavy tree cover. The team moved in silence, communicating by hand signals and whispered radio. Hank could see a single light glowing in the cabin's window, a yellow square against the black forest. Somewhere inside that square of light, Rosie was waiting. Ray's radio crackled. All units in position, no movement detected inside. Copy that, Ray responded. He turned to Hank. We are going in. Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say. Hank nodded, his heart hammered against the vest. They moved through the shadows, each step deliberate, the frozen ground muffling their boots. 4 officers flanked them, weapons drawn but lowered. The cabin grew larger as they approached, resolving from a shape in the darkness to a real place with real walls and a real door behind which a real child waited. Hank noticed a small bicycle leaning against the porch wall. Child-sized. Training wheels. Victor had bought it. The thought of the man purchasing a toy for the daughter he had terrorized her mother over sent a wave of revulsion through Hank, so powerful he had to steady himself against a tree. Not now, Ray whispered, reading his face. Focus. Hank breathed. He focused. They reached a position 20 feet from the front door. Ray raised his hand. Victor Hale, he called, his voice firm and controlled. This is Detective Beckett with the state police. We need to speak with you. The night held its breath. Wind moved through the pines. An owl called from somewhere deep in the forest. Then the porch light flickered on, casting harsh white light across the clearing, and the door opened slowly. Victor Hale stood in the doorway. He was wearing different clothes than this morning, a casual sweater and slacks, as though he had changed for the evening the way a normal person might after a normal day. His expression was calm, almost amused, the expression of a man who believes he holds all the cards, even when the table is surrounded. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe with studied casualness. "It is rather late for a house call." The sound of his voice made Hank's blood sing with rage. He clenched his fists at his sides. Then he unclenched them. Then he clenched them again. "We are here for Rosie Ray," said, his voice steady and authoritative. "We know she is inside." Victor's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "My daughter is asleep. What business do you have disturbing us at this hour?" Hank stepped forward. Ray's hand shot out to stop him, but Hank kept his voice level. "She is not your daughter, Victor. Not in any way that matters." Recognition flashed across Victor's face. The biker, he said, and the word carried the weight of everything he thought about Hank. Every judgment, every dismissal, every certainty that a man with tattoos and a criminal record was beneath consideration. "You are persistent, I will give you that." "Let her go," Hank said. "It is over." Victor laughed, and the sound in the quiet mountain night was hollow and ugly. "Over, you have no idea what you are dealing with. Rosie belongs with her father, the courts will agree." "Not with your record," Ray interjected. "Not with the restraining order. Not with the documentation Claire left behind. Not with the breaking and entering and assault charges from this morning." For the first time, something cracked in Victor's composure. His smile thinned, his eyes darted left and right, taking in the officers moving into position around the cabin. "Lies," he said, "all lies and fabrications." And then from inside the cabin, a small voice. "Uncle Hank," the words floated through the doorway like a signal fire. Hank's entire body went rigid. Behind Victor, in the warmth and light of the cabin's interior, Rosie appeared. She was wearing pajamas he did not recognize. Her hair was messy. She clutched a stuffed animal to her chest. And her eyes, Claire's eyes, found Hank in the darkness beyond the porch and locked onto him with an intensity that made everything else disappear. Victor spun around and grabbed Rosie's arm, pulling her behind him. "Get back inside." He snapped the charm, stripped away completely. The real man visible now in the grip of his hand on a child's arm and the snarl in his voice. Something dangerous rose in Hank. The old violence coiled and ready, demanding release. His hands curled into fists. One step forward and he could reach Victor. One blow and the man would drop. 10 seconds and it would be over. But Rosie was watching him. Through the gap between Victor's arm and the doorframe, her eyes were fixed on his face. Frightened, yes, but also waiting. Watching to see what he would do, who he would choose to be. Claire's words. The last message of a dying woman who had known her brother better than he knew himself. Show her there is another way. Hank unclenched his fists. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, and took one careful step forward. "Victor," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady and carried no threat at all. "Let her go. Do not make this worse for yourself." "You think I am afraid of you?" Victor snarled. "No," Hank replied, "but look around you." For the first time, Victor truly saw what surrounded him. Officers in tactical positions at every corner of the cabin, weapons drawn, no escape route that did not end in handcuffs or worse. "Last chance," Ray said from behind Hank. "Release the child and come out with your hands visible." Victor's eyes darted. Hank could see the calculation happening in real time, the desperate search for leverage, for control, for any angle that might restore the power he was losing with every passing second. "Victor," Hank said once more, "it is over." And something in the calm certainty of those words, in the absence of violence, where Victor had expected violence, in the quiet strength of a man who had chosen restraint over rage, seemed to break something in Victor Hale that anger never could have reached. His grip on Rosie's arm loosened. She pulled free and ran. Down the porch steps, across the frozen ground, small feet barely touching the earth. She ran straight to Hank, colliding with his chest, her arms wrapping around his neck with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. "I knew you would come," she whispered into his shoulder. Hank held her. He closed his eyes. He felt the cold night air on his face and the warmth of her body against his chest and the beating of two hearts that had found each other in the dark. Behind them, officers moved in. Victor shouted and struggled and made threats that the mountains swallowed without echo. Handcuffs clicked. Radio chatter filled the clearing. The operation unfolded with the precision of people who knew exactly what they were doing. But Hank heard none of it. "I will always come for you, Rosie," he said, his voice breaking. "Always." She pulled back just enough to look at his face. Her cheeks were wet with tears, but she was not crying anymore. Her expression held something that no 4-year-old should have to carry, but that this one wore with a grace inherited from her mother. It was the look of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and had just in this moment stopped. "Your face is hurt," she said, touching the gash on his temple with a gentle finger. "It does not hurt anymore," Hank said, and it was true. Nothing hurt anymore except the relief, which was so enormous, it felt like a kind of pain all its own. Ray Beckett appeared beside them, his face drawn with exhaustion, but carrying the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. "EMTs are on the way. We need to get her checked out." Hank nodded but did not put Rosie down. He was not ready to let go. Not yet. Maybe not for a very long time. They walked together toward the waiting vehicles, Hank carrying Rosie against his chest, her arms still locked around his neck. The night was cold and clear, and the stars above the mountains were bright enough to read by. Behind them, Victor Hale was being guided into the back of a police cruiser, his expensive sweater rumpled. His composure shattered, his mouth still moving with threats that no one was listening to. Rosie did not look back. She pressed her face into Hank's shoulder and breathed deeply the way a child breathes when they have finally found the one place in the world where they feel safe. As they reached the cars, Ray's radio crackled with confirmation that the area was secure. Hank stood in the cold mountain air, his breath forming clouds of the weight of the child in his arms, both impossibly light and the heaviest thing he had ever carried. He looked up at the sky, at the vast and different spread of stars. And somewhere between the exhaustion and the relief and the gratitude and the grief, he felt Claire's presence. Not as a ghost, not as a voice, but as a warmth in his chest that had not been there before. A certainty that wherever she was, she could see this moment. She could see her daughter safe in her brother's arms. And she was at last at peace. "Thank you, Claire," Hank whispered into the night. "I understand now." Rosie stirred against his shoulder. "Uncle Hank, yeah, kiddo, can we go home?" Hank closed his eyes. Home. Such a small word for something he had spent 58 years failing to find. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "We are going home." He climbed into the back of Ray's car, Rosie still in his arms, and as they pulled away from the cabin and the mountain and the place where everything had almost ended differently, Hank Donnelly watched the red and blue lights fade in the rearview mirror and felt for the first time in his life that he was driving towards something instead of away from it. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window, painting warm rectangles on the linoleum floor. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint sweetness of juice boxes. Hank sat in a plastic chair beside Rosie's bed, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together, watching the child color inside the lines of a picture book a nurse had brought her during the night. She had slept deeply, more deeply than Hank had seen her sleep before, as if the resolution of fear had unlocked something in her body that exhaustion alone could not. The doctors had insisted on keeping her overnight. A few bruises on her arm where Victor had gripped her. Slight dehydration. The psychological toll of the ordeal which they measured in careful questions and gentle observation. Hank had not left her side. He had refused treatment for his own injuries until Rosie had been examined, and even then he had only allowed the nurse to clean and bandage the gash above his eyebrow while he sat in a chair positioned to maintain a clear line of sight to Rosie's bed across the room. "Look," Rosie said, holding up her coloring book. "I made the sky purple." Hank leaned forward. His face softened in a way that still felt new, like a muscle he was learning to use after years of atrophy. "That is beautiful," he said. "Very creative." She nodded seriously and returned to her work, the tip of her tongue poking out between her lips in concentration. The bruises on her arm were visible above the hospital gown. Yellow-green marks in the shape of adult fingers. Hank looked at them and felt a cold fury settle in his chest, but he breathed through it the way he had been breathing through every violent impulse since the night on the cliff. The anger was still there. He suspected it would always be there. but it was no longer in charge. A soft knock on the door. Detective Ray Beckett stood in the doorway, his tie loosened and dark circles under his eyes, suggesting a night with very little sleep. "Morning," Ray said. "How is our brave girl doing?" Hank nodded toward Rosie. "Doctors say she is doing well, physically at least." Ray stepped inside, keeping his voice low. "Victor Hale is being processed. Between his prior record, the restraining order, the kidnapping charges, and the assault on you, he is looking at serious time. His lawyer is already trying to negotiate, but the evidence is overwhelming. Claire's documentation alone would bury him." "Good," Hank said. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had chosen not to do on that clifftop. Victor would face justice in a courtroom, not in a shallow grave in the mountains. Claire's way, the right way. "We will need statements from both of you eventually," Ray continued. "But there is no rush, and the child welfare folks will want to discuss her future," Hank finished. Ray studied him for a moment. The fluorescent light was unkind to both of them, highlighting the fatigue lines and the accumulated evidence of a long night. But something in Hank's eyes had changed. Ray could see it, the hard edge still there, but underneath it, something warmer. Something patient. "You know," Ray said, "when I first met you, I pegged you for trouble. The tattoos, the vest, the record." "You were not wrong," Hank replied. "That was me for a long time, maybe. But that is not who I saw last night." Ray placed a business card on the small table beside Hank. "Call me when you are ready to discuss next steps. There is paperwork for temporary guardianship we can get started on." Hank's head came up. "Guardianship," Ray allowed himself a small smile. "You are her uncle. With Victor's situation and your sister's documented wishes, there is a strong case." His gaze moved to Rosie, who was now drawing circles around the purple sky with a green crayon, creating something that looked like northern lights. "Plus, I have seen how she looks at you." After Ray left, a nurse came in with discharge papers and a list of instructions. "Diet, rest, follow-up appointments, signs to watch for." When she mentioned possible counseling for Rosie, Hank nodded without hesitation. "Whatever she needs," he said. "Whatever it takes." The nurse studied his face, the bandaged wound, the tattoos on his knuckles, the leather jacket draped over the back of his chair, and whatever she saw apparently passed her assessment because she smiled and said, "She is lucky to have you." Hank nearly said something about luck having nothing to do with it, about how Rosie's presence in his life was the result of a dead woman's faith in a snowstorm and a decision made on a cliff with a gun in his lap. But he just nodded because explaining the full truth to a nurse in a hospital room felt like trying to pour an ocean into a paper cup. The afternoon passed quietly. Rosie colored, Hank sat, nurses came and went. At one point, a doctor stopped by to check Rosie's vitals, and Hank watched the interaction with the fierce attention of a man who was learning that protection meant not just standing between danger and the people you love, but also knowing their blood pressure and when they last ate and whether the bruise on their arm was getting better or worse. Ray returned later that day with an update. Victor's lawyer had attempted to frame the situation as a custody dispute, arguing that a father had every right to retrieve his child. The argument had collapsed within minutes when the prosecution presented Claire's restraining order, the documented history of abuse, the evidence of forced entry and assault, and the testimony of 3 witnesses who had seen Victor's men surveilling Hank and Rosie at the park. "The DA is adding charges," Ray said. "Kidnapping, assault, breaking and entering, endangering a minor." His bail was set at $500,000. Even with his resources, he is not going anywhere soon. Hank absorbed this. And the guardianship, Ray leaned against the doorframe. "Family court is separate from criminal proceedings, but Victor's arrest strengthens your position significantly. Karen Prescott is preparing the recommendation. Combined with Claire's emergency plan, you have a strong case." He paused. "There is one thing you should know. Victor's lawyer may try to use your record against you. Assault charges, the club affiliations. They will paint you as unfit." Hank looked at Rosie, who was now drawing a house with a purple door on a fresh page. "Let them," he said. "I am not going to pretend to be something I was not. But I am not that person anymore, and every day I am alive is proof." The hospital discharged Rosie the following morning. Hank carried her out through the sliding glass doors into a day that was bright and cold and smelled like pine and possibility. He had borrowed a car seat from Mrs. Kovich and installed it in the back of the sedan with the help of a YouTube video that he watched 3 times before getting it right. Rosie climbed in and buckled up with practiced ease. She had done this before in other cars fleeing other dangers. The thought made Hank's jaw tighten. No more running. From now on, they would stand their ground. They drove back to Hank's apartment, where the broken kitchen window had been temporarily patched with cardboard and duct tape by the building superintendent. The place looked exactly as terrible as Hank remembered. Glass fragments he had missed still glinted in the carpet. The blood stain on the kitchen floor had dried to a dark brown smear. The burnt eggs were still in the pan. "Wait here," Hank told Rosie, setting her on the couch. He spent 30 minutes cleaning, sweeping glass, scrubbing the floor, throwing away the ruined food, opening windows to let the cold air push out the smell of violence and burnt grease. When he was done, the apartment was still sparse and inadequate, and nothing a child deserved. But it was clean. It was a start. That first night back, Hank put Rosie to bed and then sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pencil. He had never been a man who made plans. Plans required believing in a future, and for most of his life, the future had been a concept as foreign as kindness. But now he had a reason to plan. He had a reason to believe that tomorrow mattered. He made a list. Things Rosie needs. He wrote it in block letters at the top of the page, then sat there for a long time, the pencil hovering, because the list was so long, it felt infinite. A real bedroom, a school, a doctor, a dentist, clothes that fit, books, a park to play in, safety, stability. Someone who would be there every single morning when she woke up and every single night when she fell asleep. Someone who would never leave. Hank stared at the list and felt the weight of it. Then he picked up the pencil and added one more item at the bottom. A better man. He underlined it twice. When they were alone again, Rosie closed her coloring book and looked at Hank with an expression that was suddenly serious. The playfulness of the morning had given way to something older, a gravity that 4-year-olds should not possess, but that this one had earned through experience no child should have. "Are we going home now?" she asked. Hank hesitated. Home. His apartment had a broken window, bloodstains on the kitchen floor, and the lingering presence of violence in every corner. It was not a home. It never had been, not even before all of this. It was a place where a man without connections had stored his body between stretches of empty road. "Yes," he said, "but we might need to find a new home soon, a better one, with a room just for you." Rosie considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "Will you stay with me forever?" Hank moved from the chair to sit on the edge of her bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. Gently he took her small hand in his rough one and marveled as he did every time at the contrast. His hand was scarred and calloused and inked with fading letters. Hers was smooth and tiny and perfect. Together they looked like a before and after photograph of what life does to a person or what it could do differently given the chance. "Rosie," he said softly, "I promise you will never be alone again. We are family, and family sticks together." She studied his face the way she always did, checking for cracks in his certainty for any sign that the words might not hold. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she nodded once decisively with the confidence of a child who has chosen to believe. "Okay," she said, then more quietly, "Can I still call you Uncle Hank?" Something in Hank's chest expanded. A space that had been tight and cold for so many years he had forgotten it existed. It opened like a window in a room that had been sealed shut, and what came through was light and air and the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone completely. "You can call me whatever you want, kiddo," he said, his voice rough. "I will always answer." Rosie smiled. A real smile, the first one Hank had seen, that reached all the way to her eyes and stayed there. She held out her arms, and he gathered her against his chest, feeling her small heart beating next to his, and outside the window, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of the night. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the most important of Hank Donnelly's life. The temporary guardianship paperwork was filed within days. Karen Prescott from Social Services guided him through the process with the patience of a woman who had seen difficult situations before but recognized genuine commitment when it sat across her desk. Claire's emergency plan, naming Hank as Rosie's guardian, carried significant legal weight. The restraining order against Victor, the birth certificate listing no father, the documentation of abuse. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall that would keep Rosie safe. There were home visits, a social worker named Deborah with short gray hair and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck, came to evaluate Hank's living situation. The first visit did not go well. His apartment was clearly unsuitable for a child, cramped, sparsely furnished with a kitchen window, patched with cardboard and plastic sheeting where Victor had broken through. Mr. Donnelly, Deborah said, looking around with an expression that was professional but not encouraging. This space does not meet our minimum standards for a child's residence. I know, Hank said. He did not make excuses. He did not explain or justify. I am working on it. Within a week, he had found a new apartment, a two-bedroom unit on the first floor of a quiet building with a small fenced yard in a neighborhood park visible from the kitchen window. It cost more than he could comfortably afford, but he picked up extra shifts at the auto shop where he had been working and began the process of turning an empty space into something that resembled a home. Rosie chose the paint color for her room. Purple. Of course it was purple. Hank spent an entire Saturday with a roller and a pan and more purple paint on his clothes and arms than on the walls while Rosie supervised from a folding chair in the doorway, offering commentary with the solemnity of a building inspector. You missed a spot, she said, pointing. Where there? By the window. Hank squinted. I do not see it. Rosie crossed her arms. Mommy never missed spots. Hank dipped his roller and went over the area again. Your mom was better at most things than me, he said, but I am trying. The furniture came piece by piece. A small bed with a frame shaped like a house. A bookshelf that Hank assembled from a box, swearing quietly at instructions that seemed to have been written by someone who hated humanity. A desk for drawing, a lamp shaped like a star that Rosie picked out at a second-hand store, turning it over in her hands with the careful deliberation of a gem dealer evaluating a diamond. This one, she said. It glows. Hank looked at the price tag. $4. Sure thing, kiddo. He hung curtains in her room, white ones with small purple flowers that Mrs. Kovacs had found at a church rummage sale and brought over in a bag with a plate of homemade cookies. The elderly woman had become something of an unofficial grandmother to Rosie in the weeks since the rescue, appearing with food and small gifts and a willingness to babysit that Hank suspected was as much about her own loneliness as it was about generosity. He was grateful either way. The court hearing for permanent guardianship was scheduled for a Tuesday in early spring. Hank wore a button-down shirt and pressed slacks, the most formal clothes he owned, and sat in the courtroom with his hands folded on the table in front of him. His lawyer, a young woman named Sarah, whose dedication outstripped her experience, sat beside him with a folder thick with documentation. Rosie sat in the front row with Mrs. Kovacs, her small legs swinging above the floor, wearing a dress that was new and shoes that were shiny, and an expression of complete incomprehension about what was happening and why it required everyone to be so quiet. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Holloway, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the case file, asked questions of the social worker, examined the documentation Claire had left behind, and listened to Ray Beckett testify about Victor Hale's criminal behavior and the circumstances of Rosie's rescue. Then she turned to Hank. Mr. Donnelly, she said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had presided over 1,000 cases and learned long ago that truth hides in unexpected places. I have reviewed your record. It is not insignificant. No, ma'am, Hank said. It is not. Assault charges, association with a known criminal organization, suspected involvement in various illegal activities. Hank met her eyes. All of that is true, Your Honor. I am not going to sit here and pretend to be someone I was not. I spent most of my adult life making bad choices and hurting people. But I am not asking the court to judge who I was. I am asking for the chance to be who my sister believed I could be. The courtroom was very quiet. Your sister, Judge Holloway, said, turning a page in the file. Claire Jean Donnelly. She designated you as her daughter's guardian in her emergency plan. Yes, ma'am. Despite your record, despite years of estrangement. Hank's throat tightened. She saw something in me that I could not see in myself. I spent a long time thinking she was wrong about that. I do not think that anymore. Judge Holloway studied him over the top of her glasses. Mr. Donnelly, in my experience, the measure of a person is not found in the worst thing they have done. It is found in what they do when someone depends on them. She glanced at Rosie, who had climbed down from her seat and was now standing beside Hank's chair, her small hand resting on his arm. Uncle Hank, Rosie whispered loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. When is this over? I am hungry. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Even Judge Holloway's stern expression softened. The ruling was delivered that afternoon. Permanent guardianship of Rosie Ann Donnelly was granted to Henry James Donnelly, effective immediately. The decision cited Claire's documented wishes, the stability of Hank's current living situation, the recommendation of the Social Services Department, and the clear and evident bond between uncle and niece. Hank stood in the courthouse hallway afterward, holding the papers in his hands, and could not make himself move. The words on the page were legal language, formal and precise, but what they meant was something so vast and terrifying and wonderful that his mind could not hold all of it at once. Rosie tugged on his shirt. Uncle Hank, you said we could get ice cream if I was good. He looked down at her. Were you good? She nodded solemnly. I was very good. I only talked one time and it was important. What did you say? That I was hungry? Hank laughed. It came from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound so unfamiliar to him that it felt like someone else's voice. But it was his. It was a sound he was learning to make. They got ice cream. Rosie chose strawberry. Hank got coffee, which Rosie declared disgusting after stealing a taste. They sat on a bench outside the courthouse eating their cones in the warm afternoon sun, and for a few minutes the world was simple. Spring turned the corner into early summer. The trees along their street burst into green. The neighborhood park, which had become their daily destination, filled with children whose names Rosie was slowly learning. She was enrolled in a preschool program 3 mornings a week, and each day when Hank dropped her off, she clung to his leg for exactly 30 seconds before letting go and walking through the door without looking back. The 30 seconds never got shorter, but the letting go got easier, and Hank understood that this was how trust worked. It was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to move forward despite it. Hank's own transformation continued in ways that surprised him. He attended a parenting class at the community center, sitting in a circle of men and women half his age taking notes in a small notebook with a pencil that kept breaking because he gripped it too hard. He learned about positive reinforcement and consistent boundaries and the importance of routine. He learned that saying "I am proud of you" meant more to a child than any toy, and that listening was more powerful than speaking, and that admitting you did not know the answer was not weakness, but a form of honesty that children respected. He started seeing a counselor. This was harder than anything else. Harder than the riding, harder than the club, harder than the night on the cliff with the gun in his lap. Sitting in a quiet room with a woman named Dr. Ellsworth, who had kind eyes and a voice like still water, and talking about the things he had done and the things that had been done to him. The violence of his childhood, the violence he had chosen, the sister he had abandoned. You carry a great deal of guilt, Dr. Ellsworth observed one afternoon. Hank stared at his hands. I earned it, perhaps, but guilt is only useful if it motivates change. Beyond that, it becomes a prison you build for yourself. She paused. Your sister did not send Rosie to you because she wanted you to suffer. She sent her because she wanted you to live. The counseling helped, not in dramatic breakthroughs or sudden revelations, but in small shifts that accumulated over time. Hank began to sleep better. He began to eat meals at regular hours instead of whenever hunger became impossible to ignore. He stopped reaching for beer when the evening got quiet and reached for a book instead, or for the coloring crayons that Rosie left scattered across the kitchen table. He learned to cook. Not well, not at first, but with a determination that made up in persistence what it lacked in skill. Pancakes became his specialty by virtue of repetition. He made them every Saturday morning, and on the 3rd week, he remembered to buy blueberries. Rosie ate 6 pancakes that morning and declared them the best she had ever had, which Hank knew was not true but accepted as the highest compliment of his life. There were difficult days, days when Rosie woke up screaming from nightmares, calling for a mother who would never come. Hank would sit on the edge of her bed and hold her hand and say, I am here, I am right here, until the shaking stopped and her breathing steadied. He did not try to replace Claire. He did not pretend the grief was not real. He simply sat with her in it, a large, quiet presence in the dark, and waited for the storm to pass. There were days when his own demons surfaced. Days when the rage came back sudden and scalding, triggered by a car backfiring on the street or a man's raised voice in a grocery store. Days when the craving for the old life, for the simplicity of violence, for the numbness of alcohol pressed against his ribs like a fist. On those days, he would step outside onto the porch and breathe and look at the sky and think of Claire's words until the pressure eased. Some days it did not ease. Some days he white-knuckled his way through the hours and collapsed into bed after Rosie was asleep and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was capable of sustaining this new version of himself, or if the old Hank, the one called Stone, was simply waiting in the wings for an opportunity to reclaim the stage. But each morning he got up. He made breakfast. He walked Rosie to preschool. He went to work. He came home. He cooked dinner. He read stories. He checked for monsters. And each day that he did these things, the new life became a little more real, and the old one faded a little further into memory. Gus Harmon came to visit one Sunday. He stood in the doorway of the new apartment, looking around at the purple bedroom and the star-shaped lamp and the drawing on the refrigerator, and shook his head slowly. "Never would have believed it," Gus said. "Stone Donnelly, domestic man." "Hank," he corrected. "And I am not domestic. I burned the chicken again last night." Gus laughed and pulled 2 beers from a bag. Then he looked at Hank and put them back. "Right, sorry, forgot." Hank had not had a drink in 3 months. It was not the longest he had gone without alcohol, but it was the first time he had stopped by choice rather than circumstance. The decision had been quiet made one evening when he realized that the beer in his hand was not making anything better and was making several things worse. He had poured it down the sink and had not bought another. "Coffee," Hank offered instead. They sat on the porch while Rosie played in the yard chasing the cat from next door that had adopted their garden as its personal territory. "She looks happy," Gus said, watching Rosie. "She is getting there," Hank said. "We both are." Gus was quiet for a moment. "Claire would be proud of you." The words landed on Hank like a hand on the shoulder. He looked at his old friend, this man who had known him at his worst, and was seeing him now at something approaching his best, and felt the complicated gratitude of someone who has been given a second chance he did not earn. "I hope so," he said. Pastor Jim came to visit as well. He brought the Bible Claire had left at his church, the one Hank had held months ago, in an office that smelled of old paper and quiet faith. Hank accepted it and placed it on the bookshelf in the living room, between a book about motorcycle repair and a children's illustrated guide to the solar system. He did not read it often, but sometimes late at night when the apartment was quiet and Rosie was sleeping and the world outside was dark, he would open it and find the passages Claire had underlined. Her handwriting in the margins, small notes and thoughts and questions that she had written in the solitude of a life lived in hiding. Reading them felt like hearing her voice, faint and distant, but present, as if she had left pieces of herself scattered through the pages for him to find. One passage she had circled 3 times. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Hank was not a religious man. He did not know if he believed in God or heaven or any of the things Pastor Jim spoke about with such certainty, but he believed in Claire. And if she had found strength in these words, then they were strong enough for him. Ray Beckett called periodically with updates on the case. Victor Hale's trial was proceeding through the system with the relentless machinery of justice. His lawyer had tried every angle: custody rights, character attacks on Hank, claims of misunderstanding. Each argument was dismantled by the evidence Claire had spent years carefully, secretly documenting. The trial concluded in August. Victor Hale was convicted on charges of kidnapping, assault, breaking and entering, and endangering a minor. He was sentenced to 12 years. The judge noted the pattern of domestic violence, the restraining order, and the calculated nature of the kidnapping as aggravating factors. Hank heard the verdict over the phone while standing in the kitchen, watching Rosie through the window as she watered the flowers in the yard. He thanked Ray and hung up and stood there for a long time, feeling something he could not immediately name. It was not satisfaction. It was not joy. It was something quieter and deeper. It was the knowledge that the system Claire had never fully trusted had in the end done what it was supposed to do. That the path Hank had chosen, the harder path, the slower path, the path that did not end in blood, had led to this moment. A man in prison, a child in a garden. Justice served not by violence but by patience and evidence, and the quiet courage of a woman who had documented her suffering so that it could one day speak for her. That evening, Hank made dinner, chicken only slightly overcooked with mashed potatoes and green beans. Rosie ate everything on her plate, which was still a minor miracle that Hank never took for granted. On a warm evening in June, Hank sat on the back porch of their new apartment, watching Rosie play in the small fenced yard. She had a watering can and was tending to a row of flowers they had planted together the previous weekend. Marigolds and petunias chosen by Rosie for their colors and by Hank for their resilience. Hard to Kill, the woman at the garden center, had told him which seemed like an appropriate criterion. The sun was setting, casting the yard in gold. Fireflies had begun to appear, blinking their cold light among the flowers. Rosie chased them with her watering can, laughing each time one blinked just out of reach. Hank watched her and felt the fullness of the moment press against the walls of his chest. This was what Claire had wanted, not vengeance, not violence. This, a yard, flowers, a child laughing in the last light of the day. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the photograph. It was more worn now than when Rosie had first held it out to him in the snow. The edges were soft as cloth. The image was fading, but Claire's face was still clear, still laughing, still turned toward him with the trust that had outlasted everything he had done to betray it. He turned it over. The hidden message revealed by heat and desperation on a night that felt like a lifetime ago was barely visible now. But Hank knew every word by heart. I believe in who you are, not what you have done. He tucked the photograph back into his wallet and looked up. Rosie had stopped chasing fireflies and was walking toward him, her watering can empty, her shoes muddy, her face glowing with the particular happiness of a child who has spent an evening doing exactly what she wanted to do. Uncle Hank, she said, climbing the porch steps. Yeah, kiddo. She sat down beside him on the step close enough that her small shoulder pressed against his arm. Her hair smelled like grass and sunshine. I drew a picture at school today, she said. She reached into the pocket of her shorts and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully and handed it to him. Hank looked at the drawing. It was rendered in the bold, imprecise strokes of a child who had not yet learned that art was supposed to be difficult. Two figures stood in front of a house with a purple door. One was tall and broad with dark hair and large hands. The other was small with brown pigtails and a bright purple coat. Between them at their feet was a row of flowers in every color Rosie's crayon box could produce. Above the figures in letters that were crooked but legible, she had written to I, my family. Hank stared at the drawing for a long time. The evening light was fading and the fireflies were multiplying, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking, and in the kitchen behind them a timer was going off for the chicken he had put in the oven 40 minutes ago, and none of it mattered because the entire world had narrowed to this piece of paper and the two words written across the top in a child's uncertain hand. My family. That is real nice, Rosie, he said, and his voice came out rough and broken, and he did not try to hide it because he had learned in these months of becoming someone new that showing your heart to the people who mattered was not weakness. It was the bravest thing a person could do. Can we put it on the fridge? Rosie asked. Yeah. Hank stood up, folding the drawing carefully and holding it against his chest the way Rosie had once held the photograph, like it was the most important thing in the world. Because it was. They went inside together. Hank pinned the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a motorcycle that Mrs. Kovacs had given him as a housewarming joke. He stood back and looked at it, this small piece of paper on a kitchen appliance in a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and felt something settle into place it made him that he had not known was missing. Beside the drawing, he placed the old photograph of himself and Claire. The two images hung side by side. In one, a younger Hank smiled beside his sister, two people who did not yet know how much the world would cost them. In the other, a drawing of a man and a child in front of a house with a purple door and a garden full of flowers that a 4-year-old believed would grow forever. The timer was still going off. Hank rescued the chicken only slightly overdone and set the table for two. Rosie climbed into her chair, the one with the booster seat she was almost too big for now, and picked up her fork. Hank sat across from her. The kitchen was warm. The light above the table cast a soft glow. Through the window, the last of the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Uncle Hank, Rosie said. Yeah, is Mommy watching us? Hank looked at her. Then he looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, at Claire's laughing face, at the message hidden on the back that he would never need to read again because it lived inside him now, written not in lemon juice but in everything he had become since the night a storm brought a child into his life. Yeah, sweetheart, he said. I think she is. Rosie smiled. Good. I want her to see the flowers. They ate dinner together as the last light faded and the stars appeared, and the night settled around their small home like a blanket drawn over the shoulders of someone who has finally, after a very long journey, come to rest. Hank washed the dishes. Rosie dried them standing on a step stool, handling each plate with the careful precision her mother had taught her. When the last dish was put away, they moved to the living room where Rosie selected a book from the shelf. It was her favorite, a story about a bear who gets lost in the woods and is found by a family of rabbits who take him in and teach him that home is not a place, but a feeling. Hank read it aloud, doing different voices for each character, something he had learned to do in the weeks since becoming Rosie's guardian. His bear voice was deep and grumbly. His rabbit voices were high and quick. Rosie curled against his side on the couch, her eyes growing heavy, her breathing slowing as the story carried her toward sleep. He reached the last page, and the bear knew at last that he had found his home. Not in the forest where he was born, not in the mountains where he had wandered, but in the place where someone was always waiting for him, the place where he was loved. Rosie was asleep. Hank closed the book and set it on the end table. He looked down at the child nestled against his side, her face peaceful, her hand resting on his arm. He thought about the man he had been. Stone, the feared biker with blood on his hands and emptiness in his chest. The man who had ridden through blizzards because the cold was easier to feel than anything else. The man who had pushed away the only person who loved him because he believed he was not worth loving. That man was not gone. Hank knew he never would be completely. The darkness was part of him, woven into his history, written in the scars on his knuckles and the tattoos on his hands. But it was not all of him, and it did not have to be the part that decided what came next. He thought about the night he had found Rosie, the snow, the purple coat, the photograph clutched in small frozen hands. If he had not stopped at that turnout, if he had kept riding, pushing through the storm, the way he always did, Rosie would have died under that tree. A 4-year-old girl frozen to death in the mountains, and no one would have known her name. But he had stopped. Something had made him look. Something had pulled him off the bike and into the snow and toward that flash of color in the darkness. He did not know if it was fate or chance or the universe correcting a debt that was long overdue. He only knew that it had happened and that it had changed everything. Claire had seen that. From a distance, through years of silence, she had watched her brother and seen beneath the leather and the anger to the person she remembered. The boy who had checked for monsters under her bed. The teenager who had stood between her and their father's rage. The young man who had promised to always protect her. She had believed in that person even when he did not exist. And by believing, she had made him real. Hank carefully lifted Rosie and carried her to her bedroom. The purple walls glowed faintly in the light from the star-shaped lamp. He tucked her into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, adjusting the stuffed bear beside her pillow. "Good night, Rosie," he whispered. She stirred without waking. Her lips moved, forming a word that might have been his name or might have been nothing at all. He stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, and felt a promise he had made on a dark night months ago settle around him like something permanent. "I will protect you at all costs, with everything I am." He pulled the door almost closed, leaving it open a crack so the hallway light could find its way in. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter looking at the 2 images on the refrigerator. The photograph and the drawing, the past and the present, Claire's faith and Rosie's love. He took the photograph down carefully, held it one more time, studied Claire's face, her smile, the way her head was tilted toward him, as if she already knew even then that he was the one she would trust with everything. "I kept my promise," Claire Hank said quietly. He said it to the photograph and to the memory, and to the empty kitchen, and to the night outside, and to whatever part of his sister might still exist in the spaces between stars. Then he placed the photograph back on the refrigerator beside Rosie's drawing and stood there in the quiet kitchen of his quiet home, a man who had come in from the cold at last. The night was still. The house was warm. Somewhere in the yard, the flowers they had planted were growing in the dark, reaching toward a morning that would come as mornings always do, carrying with it the light. And in the bedroom at the end of the hall, behind a door left open, just a crack, a little girl slept soundly with a photograph on her nightstand and a drawing of 2 stick figures on her wall, in the absolute certainty born of experience and tested by fire that she was safe, that she was home, that someone would always be there when she called. Uncle Hank, always.